Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Behind the Headlines. And in this programme, which we shall be discussing a huge geostrategic changes that are taking place in the United States as China attempts to push America out of its perch as the dominant player in the Middle East, as they have famously broken an agreement between the Iranians and the Saudis, as these two sworn enemies sign a normalization agreement that has serious and dangerous repercussions, not only for the Middle East and American influence in the region, but also for Israel. It could possibly damage the warming of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, potentially damaging the Abraham Accords, and meaning that could escalate Iran's desire to build nuclear weapons. Reagan, so much is happening geostrategically in our world today. I mean, when I was producing this program, this was before we had Russia and China now forming an alliance, and we have Xi Jinping on an official state visit to Moscow, a 3-day visit to strengthen Russian-Chinese relations. And now we're seeing in the heart of the Middle East now two sworn enemies that theologically have been at war ever since the death of Muhammad, and who would succeed him, between the Shiites and the Sunnis, between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And under the patronage of the Chinese government, have now formed a normalization agreement between the Iranians and the Saudis that effectively puts an end to the Middle Eastern and Western alliance to effectively stop Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. And it looks like China is now the most dominant player in the Middle East. And I think this spells ominous and dangerous signs, not only for Israel, but also for the West as well.
You're exactly right, Simon, in regards to the historic grievances between the two nations. Saudi is primarily Sunni, Iran is primarily Shia. And so there's that historical rift. There have been some measure of diplomatic relations the two nations have enjoyed previously, but those were completely severed since 2016. But from 2019, there were attempts by other third parties to broker such a relationship. It's interesting, there's a few different perspectives that are out there. Beijing, China has been the final party in sealing the deal as such, cementing their place as being extremely influential, if not the most influential global power in the Middle East at the moment, especially among nations like the Arab nations and the Persian nation. The original attempt to get the nations back together, apparently, though, was spawned in Iraq, which itself is a good mix of Shia and Sunni as a nation. Iraq, viewers may recall, has, in this case, speaking diplomatically, we're excluding the Kurdish region of Iraq, which has its own governance and its own legislation. But Iraq, outside of Kurdistan, last year condemned any relationship with Israel. Even if you have business with or dealings with Israel on a formal basis and you are in Iraq, again excluding Kurdistan, you could be liable to severe penalties, even death. Right, so Iraq has played a part in brokering this. China has sealed the deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. One concern that also emerges from this is the news that there was a softening of relationship between Saudi Arabia and Israel. We began to see some travel open up, just completely unprecedented, really, travel between Israel and Saudi Arabia, some friendlier relationships. Saudi looking at the possibility of entering those Abraham Accords that many of us have taken much joy in witnessing, seeing an improvement of relationship between Israel and many Arab nations. What will be the impact now that Saudi is on good diplomatic relationship terms with Iran? What will be the impact of that for Israel?
No, well, effectively means that the Saudis effectively recognise Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons and won't do anything to stop it, and will try and use the Chinese leverage to keep the Iranians in check. It also means the Saudis now will also develop their own nuclear weapons, and there's only one person we can blame for this absolute mess, and that's President Biden in the United States. It's a complete US withdrawal from the Middle East, and of course not only is this the world's most dangerous region, but it's also rich in oil and natural gas, and this is what the Chinese also are thinking, that if they are the dominant player, this secures them kind of natural energy resources such as oil and gas for their economy and for their building up of their military arsenal, which they're currently doing. So this is extremely troubling, and also means that Israel's running out of regional allies in the region, but also fearing that America will not come to Israel's backing if Israel's involved in a major military confrontation with Iran. So we're also seeing really the decline of the United States as a world superpower and a shift in the new order, which is going to be China dominated. And I think China had a vision of wanting to replace the United States by the year 2049, but I think that is happening far quicker than we could ever possibly imagine, as the United States is in perpetual decline as a military economic powerhouse, and the days of American dominance and influence in the world are certainly on a knife's edge with the Biden administration in the White House.
China invests heavily in Saudi Arabia. In fact, I believe China is its leading investment partner, and so it makes sense that China would want to maintain a relationship, and for China being almost totally un-Islamic, apart from the Uyghur section, which I remind viewers is extremely persecuted, the Uyghurs there in that area of China. China has a very much bipartisan take on it. They don't care about the Shia-Sunni conflict. They just care about the economic growth and the economic success of both Saudi and Iran benefits China, because as it's invested heavily in both societies, outside of any religious matters, it's all about business. And so it wants to see any barrier to growth economically in the Middle East removed. Ongoing conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran hinders economic growth for both nations. And so just from a practical business economic standpoint, an alliance makes sense. That doesn't make it moral. That doesn't make it ethical. That doesn't make it right or safe. It makes it none of those things. But from a business, money standpoint, and that's all China is concerned about in this scenario, it makes sense. The significance of this cannot be downplayed. This is Beijing's first interaction, its first foray into Middle Eastern politics and brokering of deals.
In 2021, according to my notes here, that China signed a 25-year strategic agreement with the Iranian regime last year, followed by a 6-year agreement with the Gulf Cooperation Council. And also seeing that the Chinese now brokered a deal between the Iranians and the Saudis, two sworn enemies that hate each other, that are theologically opposed to one another. And we've seen there are two wars going on in the Middle East that really expands upon this, as the war in Yemen, in which the Saudis are directly involved in fighting against, and so are the Iranians, and also Syria as well, a mirror reflection of the wider struggle within the Middle East for the most dominant theological Islamic position of Shia or Sunni. But we've also got to remind ourselves as well that this week as well is also the 20th anniversary since the Gulf War II, and which we saw American and coalition forces overthrow Saddam Hussein and his Ba'athist regime. And effectively, the aftermath of that war changed the balance of power in the Middle East from the Sunni-dominated power in the region to that of the Shiites, and therefore the Iranians are able to fulfill their dream of establishing the Islamic Shia crescent over the region, sweeping from Tehran, Iran, straight into Iraq, into Syria, into Lebanon, where the ultimate goal is to control and dominate Jerusalem, and that's why it's so key to this is the destruction of Israel. This weakens the Abraham Accords and the alliance against Iran from the Middle East to prevent them from acquiring nuclear weapons as well. So this agreement could spell a kind of disaster, really, essentially, for Israel and the forces for peace and moderation in this very dangerous region of the world.
Well, let's rewind a little bit and talk through some of the background, the historic background that makes such a deal so significant. The history, as we've already alluded to, between the two nations is sketchy at best. There's been a relationship marred by continual conflict, at the very least on an ideological level and philosophical level due to religious differences. Culturally, there are differences as well. So often it's easy to lump the Middle East into one massive perspective, but that's a massive mistake. Culturally, very, very different. Yes, similarities, but in Saudi Arabia, they are, as the name indicates, Arabs, and in Iran, also, the language there is Farsi, also called Persian. They're Persian, right? So the Persian Empire really stems from that region, from Iran, and you can, even to this day, Iran is filled with so many sites of biblical interest and importance that are almost inaccessible to everyone else in the world.
Daniel's tomb as well.
Absolutely.
One.
Esther, also very, very significant. The relationship between the two nations deteriorated heavily following, because remember, there's been periods of time where both nations were, you could say, semi-liberal, and that they weren't holding to a fundamentalist brand of Islam. But with the Islamic Revolution in 1979, that completely changed. We see the two countries finding themselves on opposite sides in various proxy wars. Yemen is the most recent example, and it is ongoing. And so it'll be interesting to see what transpires as a result of this agreement in Yemen. But Saudi Arabia has often been attacked by Iranian-backed rebels in neighboring Yemen, firing hundreds of missiles and armed drones into Saudi Arabia, killing dozens of civilians.
Absolutely. Also see that Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons has further strained relations between the two foes. A major concern about Iran possessing nuclear weapons beyond its direct threat to Israel is the fear of a regional nuclear arms race. In December, the Saudi foreign minister stated, if Iran gets operational nuclear weapons, all bets are off. Egypt and Turkey are often cited as regional nations that could seek nuclear weapons, as well as the United Arab Emirates and Algeria. And according to the Jewish News Syndicate, which is a great publication, last August, the Chinese president made his first international trip since 2020 to Saudi Arabia. The visit was seen as a sign of waning American influence in the region. The Biden administration insisted the United States was not going anywhere after President Joe Biden met with the Saudis the previous month. A joint statement following the president's visit dealt with the need to defer Iran's interference in the internal affairs of other countries, its support for proxy terrorism through its armed proxies, and its efforts to destabilize the security and stability of the region. But let's go back and say when this historic agreement was brokered by the Chinese. So on Friday, the 10th of March, China shocked the world as it announced that Saudi Arabia and Iran were to normalize relations after 7 years of having no diplomatic relations at all. We see that this is part of a wider geostrategic picture of China ousting the United States as the main power broker in the Middle East and ushering a Chinese-led New World Order. Effectively, the Saudis have had nowhere else to turn since they've been humiliated by the Biden administration and been ridiculed, and the Saudi kingdom has been ridiculed and given no assurances of protection. So Riyadh has actually turned to China for protection. Saudis are hoping that this brokered agreement also end the Sunni Iranian proxy war known as in the Lebanon. And so therefore this is dangerous. But one thing that's really concerned the Saudis is that when it comes to the Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons, is that the Biden administration remained silent after the IAEA, which is the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is the nuclear watchdog on behalf of the United Nations, announced that the Iranians were enriching uranium to a staggering 84%, so close to weapons-grade material. And virtually the United States has given guarantees that they will not allow the Iranian regime to develop nuclear weapons. And the Saudis are looking at the evidence and saying, you're so close to developing nuclear weapons. When is America going to step in and prevent this from happening? You're not. So therefore, we need protection from a more powerful superpower. So we're turning to the Chinese because the Americans are so unreliable.
Saudi might be looking at this to some degree as a safeguard against Iran should it choose to use any nuclear weapons at some point in the future. They are, again, having their highest levels of uranium enrichment that they've ever had. They're said to be months away from a nuclear bomb-making capability. I mean, we've heard this for a while. We did a program about a year ago where we were told it was
a few programs.
Yeah, quite a few programs. But we were told, it was maybe only a matter of weeks away at that point. So there's a lot of uncertainty as to how far along they actually are in this program. But what we know is that they're very, very close. So Saudi keeping their enemy close, there's that old adage that, keep your friends close, keep your enemies closer. And maybe that's some of their thinking. But the White House definitely does seem to feel snubbed in this scenario. They have made a statement through the National Security Council spokesman John Kirby, who said, "We support any effort to de-escalate tensions in the region. We think it's in our interests." He added that the Biden administration had made similar efforts in that direction, completely ineffectual. You can try and claim a victory, it doesn't make it.
But this is a lack of understanding of how the Middle East operates, and this is a complete naivety or deliberate malice on behalf of the Biden administrations and its relations with Saudi Arabia. I mean, Saudi Arabia has been kind of demonized by this American administration. And if we take a look back in 2017, we realized that President Trump did two things with his policies towards the Middle East. He geared up US foreign policy to protecting Saudi Arabia and also Israel, and that these were the two powers that he was backing in that region to form an alliance against the Iranian regime from developing nuclear weapons. And effectively what we've seen is that the Biden administration has effectively tore up that policy, not only endangered Saudi Arabia but also endangered Israel as Iran gets closer and closer to having nuclear weapons capacity. So let's remind ourselves of the historic agreement that was broken by the Chinese and forming a normalization pact between two sworn enemies in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia and the Islamic Republic of Iran.
After more than a year of meetings and 4 days of negotiations in Beijing between Iran and Saudi Arabia, China said the three nations reached an agreement. The deal includes resumption of diplomatic relations, reopening their embassies within 2 months, and a commitment to respect each other's sovereignty, keeping out of their internal affairs. Many Middle East observers are concerned over China's role in brokering the deal.
The new and deeply concerning factor here is the Chinese role in all of this. To suddenly find, kind of as a surprise, that our new great power competitor, the primary threat to the American-led world order. China was so central to this deal that involves not only our worst enemy in the Middle East, but bringing them together with one of our oldest Arab friends and allies and partners in the region, Saudi Arabia.
Jason Greenblatt, one of the architects of the Abraham Accords, says it reveals China's growing influence and America's waning power in the region, and should be a wake-up call to the Biden administration.
The United States essentially has ceded some important ground, an important area for U.S. stability and security, to China to some degree. That's not good for the United States. I think the United States ought to pay attention.
Hannah recently visited Saudi Arabia and met with its top leaders. He says Saudi is hedging its bets because its relationship with the U.S. is not as strong as it once was.
If the Saudis had their druthers, the relationship with the United States would be strong, secure. They'd have enormous trust and confidence in it. Unfortunately, that has all eroded drastically over the last 2 years. That was the message we heard when we were in Riyadh.
CBN News asked Greenblatt what this means for Israel.
I think Israel needs to take a very, very close watch at this. I think they need to look forward and figure out how do they protect Israel.
Despite this deal, Greenblatt remains bullish on the Abraham Accords and believes it's still possible Saudi Arabia could join.
And I think we can look to the UAE to understand a country that has recognized a way to be close with Israel, develop strong ties with Israel, do significant business, and have security cooperation with Israel, while at the same time being realistic and understanding that Iran is also part of the region, and they can have ties with Iran while at the same time as having ties with Israel.
With the agreement just days old, many questions still remain about its impact on the region, from the possibility of Saudi Arabia joining the Abraham Accords to the war in Yemen.
And we're now joined on Behind Headlines by Dr. David Wormser. He is the Senior Scholar for the Centre for Security Policy. He's also an advisor to the former Vice President Dick Cheney in the White House and has been instrumental in formulating US foreign policy to the Middle East. David, warm welcome to the programme.
Well, thank you. It's a great honor to be here.
Pleasure. And David, what are your thoughts on this Chinese brokered normalization agreement between two sworn enemies in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia and the Islamic Republic of Iran?
Well, first of all, I doubt that there is longevity in this new relationship. I don't see the Saudis and the Iranians, for various historical, theological, political, geopolitical reasons, really coming together in the long term. But this is a short-term, pragmatic agreement that is a function of a number of things. First of all, Saudi Arabia sees in China the ability to essentially broker some sort of a pause in its strategic competition with Iran and to restrain Iran. And as a result, it's put some quid pro quos to China for its ties with China, which were to essentially restrain Iran against China. And Iran, for its own reasons, wants to use China to break its isolation. Its regime is under severe internal stress and threat from its own population, as well as a threat of an Israeli strike against its nuclear program. So the Iranian regime has some reason to come to terms with the Chinese regime in order to create a more, quote, normal circumstance for a short period of time. And so there's the agreement. But behind it all is what, in my view, is a collapse of the American position in the region.
Would you say that this in some way can serve as a catalyst through which China can secure dominance in the Middle East as opposed to U.S. Previous dominance?
Well, what's ironic about this, or rather surprising about this, is the United States to some extent has welcomed this and claims that it was even encouraging it all along. But this gives China truly a strong position in the Middle East. There's no doubt that China has really anchored itself now. That said, China is not a global projection power. When things really come down to the use or need of power, or the need of protection, which Saudi Arabia ultimately is seeking, that can be done on the short term diplomatically, but in the long term, Saudi Arabia, Israel, other countries that rely on the West or have traditionally relied on the West will find China is not a power that can ultimately protect them. So they still need a strong horse. Right now, the Chinese relationship with Saudi Arabia, I think, is as much of a signal to jolt Washington and let it know that that Saudi Arabia needs the United States to come to terms again with its regional position and its traditional relationships, rather than withdraw or confuse its friends and its enemies in the region. So I think this is partly also a Saudi signal to Washington to come back to a certain grounded position, because ultimately I think Saudi Arabia knows that's its only path to survival.
And David, what does this new agreement, whether it's long-lasting or not, between the Saudis and the Iranians actually interpret for us in terms of Biden's Middle Eastern foreign policy?
Well, I think it tells us it's a catastrophic failure, that our allies in the region are scrambling to appease our enemies. And that includes China, but most particularly Iran. It breaks Iran's isolation. It takes considerable pressure off the Iranian regime. These are catastrophic failures of United States policy. We cannot moderate the regime in Iran. It will not moderate, and the Iranian people are telling us that very clearly. So any U.S. policy that still believes that this is a path out for Iran and to moderation is delusional. So this is a catastrophic failure that will unfold over the next years, really months, vis-a-vis Iran. And also with the Chinese position, the United States right now is in a global strategic competition with China, and we shouldn't be handing regions over to it. It's also to some extent a question of Israel, and what will Israel do? Israel is in the same boat as China, as Saudi Arabia. It feels somewhat abandoned. The United States is not where it should be vis-a-vis its own enemies. And in some ways, the Biden administration is quite hostile to the government and, in fact, to Israel as a whole. So the Israelis potentially could become a regional strong-horse, but they can do that only with a certain degree of, at least for the near term, independence of action. So I see this as a fundamental collapse on every level, including the Israeli-American relationship, of the United States policy.
What does this mean for any ongoing Mideast coalitions? We've talked a little bit about the Abraham Accords and how this deal could hinder further relaxation of relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia. What do you foresee in that regard?
Yeah, I think it's actually a little overblown how much of an impact it has. I think ultimately the Saudis are looking very carefully at Israel. They know that the United States has lost its way. The real question in Riyadh right now is, has Israel lost its way with the United States, or will Israel emerge as somewhat of a replacement for the United States? The way the Israelis answer that question ultimately determines the course of the Abraham Accords. If Saudi Arabia sees Israel stand on its own two legs and emerge as a major regional power that's dependable, you could see the Abraham Accords, not in the long term, quite soon, flourish even more deeply and greatly. If, on the other hand, the Israelis follow the United States into a hunkered down position, to some way reconcile, for whatever reason, with where Iran is going right now, then the Saudis will deem Israel useless. And at the end of the day, that would threaten the Abraham Accords.
And David, do you actually see that with this brokered agreement with the Chinese and with the Iranians and with the Saudis, that effectively this means that the Middle Eastern coalition that was there set up through the Trump administration to stop Iran from developing nuclear weapons, is this the Saudis signaling to the Iranians that we've come to terms with the reality that you are going to be a nuclear power and that you can have nuclear weapons?
Yeah, they're scared. This is exactly what they're afraid of, is that the United States is very clearly signaling that it can, on some level, live with Iran threshold nuclear state. They are currently waiting for the verdict on whether Israel is going to change that reality. But until Israel does, I think the Saudis right now begin to understand that their power is insufficient to defend themselves against Iran. And they really have no choice, but for the moment at least, to come to terms with Iran. And the Chinese are the only safe vehicle for them to try to do that at the moment. So yes, I do think that that's where Riyadh is headed with the sense of rapprochement with Iran.
Very briefly, could you identify any specific dangers to Israel that this deal presents?
Well, clearly the lifting of sanctions on Iran, which are not part of this deal, but are certainly encouraged, the collapsing, lifting, erosion, the combination of formal and informal breakdown of the isolation of the Iranian regime does two things. One is it gives it money, and money then is used to build an arsenal and engage in dangerous activities that genuinely threaten Israel, from Hezbollah to the Houthi. The other side, the breaking and isolation also relieves the internal pressure on the Iranian regime. Ultimately, where Israel is heading, and where really the Iranian opposition is heading, is that there's no real resolution of this problem until this regime is removed in Iran, and this moves that day further away.
David, well, just want to thank you so much for being our special guest on today's Behind Headlines. Thank you for giving your expert insight view on what's happening in the Middle East, and so great that you can join us today, and just really appreciate the excellent work that you do and the analysis you provide regarding Israel and the Middle East.
Thank you, Simon.
Well, very thankful for those helpful words from Dr. David Wormser. Simon, what we've seen, I think, is a failure of the Biden administration to meaningfully involve itself in the Middle East. You can talk about all manner of other areas, all manner of other scenarios where it's failed, but it does truly look like it's lost its grip.
No, it does. And this is very, very dangerous, because essentially you give up your control and influence in the Middle East, means that you are then I think also part of this as well is that America is no longer dependent upon oil from the Middle East. And I think a big part of that is the case why America feels that she can disinvest herself from the region. But we have to understand this is the world's most dangerous region. We have the world's most dangerous regimes living in this region. We have the Iranians, who are the world's leading sponsor of international terrorism. They signed a 25-year security pact with China last year. They are horrendous abusers of human rights. You only have to look at the protest movements in Iran to see the suffering of the Iranian people against this oppressive regime. We also see the likes of other, we still have the ongoing war in Syria that people tend to forget. We've got Turkey, who's led by President Erdogan, who's a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. We have the Qataris, who are sponsoring the Muslim Brotherhood. And we did have a kind of force for moderation and stability, which was formulated by the Abraham Accords, the likes of Israel, the Gulf states, Egypt, and Jordan as well, being a force. And that's why it needs American influence. It needs American protection, because within Arab culture, they always want a protector. And it's called the strong horse. So it doesn't matter if they are a Christian nation or whether they're an atheist nation like China. What they want is security guarantees and their protection, and they will go to anyone who will give them to it, essentially. So what we're seeing now is that the Chinese, because the Americans under the Biden administration have refused to honor the Saudis, they failed to kind of recognize their role in the region. They've gone to the Chinese, but also I think this is such short-sightedness on behalf of the Biden administration, because if we look at Mohammed bin Salman, the effective ruler of Saudi Arabia, the amount of reforms that he's brought into Saudi Arabia, incredible. I mean, Saudi Arabia for the last 50 plus years was supporting and promoting Wahhabism. the most dangerous interpretation of Sunni Islam. This is why they supported the group terror organizations like Al-Qaeda. They then supported anyone that would, like the Muslim Brotherhood, who would then carry out terrorist attacks around the world. So they've done a lot to curb the Islamic extremism within Saudi Arabia, opening up to allowing women to drive in cars, to have jobs and professions. So there's almost like a cultural revolution taking place right now in Saudi Arabia, particularly surrounded by their No One project to build this multi-billion-pound city, which is all going to be AI technology. They want it to be the financial investment city in the entire Middle East, replacing Dubai.
Well, what we see, I think, Simon, is a degree in Saudi Arabia of, in the past few years, of evolution, not revolution in the sense it's a process. It's been working, but it does feel like the Biden administration has not kept up. Like it's not aware of those changes that are being made, which are significant and which are meaningful. You have to work with where you're at without. It's very important that we recognize the precarious nature of what's been going on. Saudi Arabia has a horrible human rights history, inarguable, but there are changes that are being made. The United States, rather than supporting the aiding of those changes and helping facilitate other changes that would be good and healthy for the entirety of the Middle East, has, under the Biden administration, almost refused to recognize the good and the positive. Even Biden comes along after all of the efforts during the Trump administration to see some peace made in the region, even producing the Abraham Accords, seeing a lot of headway, even minus Trump's involvement now, but continued momentum from that, with the hope that those relational ties will be strengthened between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Biden comes in with the promise during his presidential campaign, just completely blinkered to the inflammatory nature of his comments, saying that Saudi Arabia, he's going to make them pay the price and make them the pariah that they are, throwing in gratuitously that there was, quote, very little social redeeming value in the present government in Saudi Arabia. This is the best government they've had.
Oh, of course it is. Of course it is. But also a big part of this as well is it's a continuation pretty much of the Obama administration's policies towards the Middle East, which perversely is designed to empower the Iranian regime and to recognize and to empower the Iranian regime to be the most powerful force in the Middle East that would receive American patronage and support, and thus change the kind of delicate Sunni Shiite alliance, because for some reason we see that President Obama, when he was president, was obsessed with the Iranian regime, giving them billions and billions in sanctions relief, even flying aircraft into Tehran late at night with billions of US dollars on board the cargo plane. So there is a great danger there. But we also see the fact is that the Biden administration, for example, and Biden in particular blamed the Saudis for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the prominent Muslim Brotherhood journalist, in 2018, without any firm evidence that the Saudis did this. And of course this humiliated the Saudi kingdom. And then of course we saw that last summer that President Biden visited the Saudis, and they were completely disgusted. He wanted them to pump more oil to improve the cost of living, and they turned around and said no, in total humiliation to Biden. So again, it's also not understanding the region, it's not understanding how it works, and also, effectively throwing America's allies such as Israel, the Saudis, the Egyptians, the Jordanians under a bus and allowing the extremist elements within the region to take control, which is incredibly dangerous.
What's forced Saudi's hand in this, and I think we should be under no illusion that their hand has been forced to look elsewhere for security, is that in accordance to leading Saudi journalist and former newspaper editor Tariq al-Hamayed, Washington and the West have not been serious about the region's security since concluding the Iranian nuclear agreement in 2015. As recently as January, when International Atomic Energy Agency Chief Rafael Grossi made it clear that the only countries making bombs are enriching uranium at Iran's level, Saudi Arabia's Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, Adel al-Jubeir, repeated the Saudi concerns. I believe that Iran has an obligation to give up its nuclear program. I believe that Iran must be in compliance with the terms of the International Atomic Energy Agency, and Iran, if it wants to be a member in good standing of the international community, needs to respect international law, needs to respect international order. And yet, what has the Biden administration persisted in doing? Though the mounting evidence all pointed to Iran cheating on the deals that were being made previously, leading to that deal being scrapped during the Trump administration, it has persisted in pursuing such a deal to the threat and detriment of that whole region.
No, absolutely. And also, let's have a look at this other CBM news item, which talks about intelligence expert goes inside the Middle East with predictions in new book regarding this new agreement between the Saudis and the Iranians.
Avi Melamed, great to be with you in Jerusalem Dateline. Big news here in the Middle East just a few days ago. Iran, Saudi Arabia signed an agreement brokered by China. What's your reaction to this?
Well, a couple of immediate observations. The first one, we're not looking at a honeymoon. The Saudis and the Iranians are, totally hostile one to the other. There is a lot of animosity and mistrust between the two sides. So we should be very clear about it. It's not that we're going to see a new chapter in the Middle East. As for the role of China, this is the big story, because China, as I've been saying for a long period of time, is becoming a very significant player in the region. And actually, that specific achievement of the Chinese diplomacy reflects the growing impact of China in the region on the one hand, and the declining hegemony of the West on the other hand.
What does it signal about the United States in particular, about their waning influence here in the region?
Well, it's not a secret that many in the Arab world, and it's very clear, are saying, look, one major reason for the fact that China was the one brokering this deal is because there is a lot of discontent, disappointment, and frustration within Arab states, and particularly the Gulf monarchies, and on top of it, Saudi Arabia, with the policy of the United States of America. And by the way, it goes only not back to the time of Biden currently, but also back to the time of President Trump. We have to remember that during the presidency of Trump, Saudi Arabia was directly attacked by the Iranians a couple of times, and also by the Houthis in Yemen, but there was no repercussion, sort of speaking, in that context, that there was no reaction by the United States of America. And then also with the Biden administration, there is a lot of discontent and frustration between the Saudis and the administration. So to a large extent, the fact that China was able to broker that deal and not the United States of America, to a large extent, not exclusively, but to a large extent reflects the fact that there is a lot of frustration and distrust towards the American administration.
So if China has basically come in the door in the Middle East, what do you see in the future? Will they try to expand their influence?
Definitely. They're already expanding the Middle East is enormously significant for China. China has two major ultra-strategic interests. One is energy security, and the other one is food security. And in both contexts, and particularly energy security, the Middle East is crucial for China. China imports from Saudi Arabia every day 2 million barrels of oil. China imports 40% of its oil from the region, from the Middle East, and particularly from the Gulf area. So China has a lot of interest, and it's deepening its presence in the Middle East, and it's going to expand its presence and accordingly its influence in the Middle East.
What does that say for Israel right now, and what impact will it have on Israel?
Well, basically, I think that to a large extent, this is something good for Israel, because China is very much interested in Israel. Because of Israel's location offshore the eastern basin of the Mediterranean, because of Israel's advanced economic, technological, military capacities, and so on. China does not hide its interest to invest in Israel. In fact, the Chinese are massively invested in Israel. So Israel, in that sense, is a very significant component for the Chinese grand vision of one belt, one road. And that, in a way, kind of like play to the hands of Israel. That being said, we have to also to remember that the Chinese hug is a little bit like a bear hug. You have to be careful with that. So Israel is kind of like, doing this very complex dance between China on the one hand, the United States of America on the other hand, because in the end of the day, the United States of America is the biggest strategic partner and ally of Israel in the region. But I'm saying about the Middle East, there is no one single player in the Middle East that allow himself to ignore any message from China. You don't ignore messages from China because it's a massive, big, giant player, and Israel is included within that.
Yeah. One of the initial observations I had was if Saudi Arabia is now aligning itself, signing this agreement with Iran, brokered by China, does this mean that Saudi Arabia won't be joining the Abraham Accords?
No, not necessarily, but I have to be very clear about it. I know that when we saw the Abraham Accords, there were many people that said, oh, the next day we are going to see an Israeli-Saudi agreement. And I said constantly it's not going to happen. It will take a long time because there are many obstacles to cross through the way. Saudi Arabia knows exactly what the mullah regime in Tehran is like. The Saudis have no illusions, and they are not going to drop the card that is called Israel, because from the Saudis' perspective, Israel is a very significant, potentially strategic ally. Up until now, there has been an ongoing low-profile dialogue, I would even say pragmatic dialogue, between Israel and Saudi Arabia in different areas. That dialogue will continue. It's not going to stop because Saudi Arabia signed an agreement with the Iranians. And therefore, I think that it will be more or less the same thing that was before the agreement of the Saudis and the Iranians. The dialogue between Israel and Saudi Arabia will continue and will develop.
Well, it was very interesting and helpful perspective there. It sounds like there is definitely a level of skepticism whether or not such a deal will actually happen between Saudi Arabia and Israel that sees a normalization.
I think there's 4 weeks gap now for the Americans to wake up and smell the coffee and to realize the danger of this normalization agreement between the Iranians and the Saudis and effectively handing the Chinese complete control of the region. And really we've got to spell out the dangers of this as well. This has also come about as well, I think, because of Israel's security situation, the internal demonstrations against this government in Jerusalem led by Benjamin Netanyahu, and the legal reforms and the mass protests that we're seeing in Israel. We're also seeing, according to Dr. Harold Rode as well, that Hezbollah terrorists in the north he actually walked into Israel and walked 16 miles into Israel without being picked up. And they wouldn't have done that if there wasn't a kind of fear of Israeli retaliation. So the danger is that Israel's mystique and its military prowess is being questioned now by the Iranians because they feel emboldened because they have Chinese protection. And also a feeling of Russian protection as well, and they know that America's influence in the world is waning so much. They don't think that America will intervene militarily on Israel's behalf. So this puts Israel in a very dangerous position, and of course, what a normalization of agreement between Israel and the Saudis would have done was to effectively shore up an anti-Iranian coalition in the Middle East that would have been a force for good and a force for moderation in the Middle East, and certainly would have meant that the rise of Islamic extremism, the threat of kind of nuclear proliferation, the stopping of Iran from developing nuclear weapons was very much on the cards. But my fear now with this new agreement is that the Israelis now are not in a strategic place to take out Iran's nuclear facilities, And it means that the Saudis have effectively agreed to allow or to live with the fact that Iran will have nuclear weapons. The Americans are not going to intervene. We have the backing of the Chinese. The Chinese now is the most dominant player, and now we're going to have to rely on China's goodwill in order to prevent the further escalation of terrorism, violence, and nuclear blackmail in the region.
Well, across the board, politically, nationally, even individually, I'm convinced that something that is absolutely paralyzing the West is our habitual procrastination and piddling about, not really taking action where we can, where we should, not taking risks maybe even that need to be taken. And you can even look to signs of the U.S.'s struggle to involve itself meaningfully in regard to a recent deal that was made where China closed a deal for jet fighters with the UAE, United Arab Emirates. The driver for that agreement was a delay by the United States to sell F-35s. China has also sold weapons in Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Turkey, Morocco, and Algeria. It's positioning itself as a reliable business partner, as a reliable arms trader, whatever people think, or I mean, I don't know that anyone is keen on the arms trade as such, but it is a legitimate part of our world at the moment. And China is increasingly being viewed as a quick respondent, a hard-working, proactive business partner
it goes beyond more than business. I mean, this is essentially about finding a protector.
Yeah.
And a protectorate. Someone who will guarantee Saudis protection, military protection in the face of any threat. So this is why, for example, their agreement with the Iranians has allowed them to say the Saudis can seek the same thing. And effectively, this means the end of American dominance and influence in the Middle East. That America's been involved in the Middle East ever since the 1956 Suez Crisis. And then, of course, the two powers at play then was the Soviet Union and the United States. And, the Middle East was split into two camps. You're either in the Soviet camp, such as the Egyptians and the Iraqis, and the Syrians were involved, or you're in the kind of Western camp, which was Turkey and Israel as well. So, we see a fundamental geostrategic shift in power in the Middle East. And this really does talk about the decline and influence of America, but also raises question marks over what is the future of the Abraham Accords. This is something that the Israelis will be very concerned about, particularly as the Chinese want to organize a conference for the Gulf Cooperation Council to bring the Gulf states under their influence. So who knows what this means for the future of the Abraham Accords? What does this mean for Israel's ongoing normalizations of relations in the Middle East? And does this alienate Israel even further, as we're really seeing the decline or the absence of American power in the region, which is a scary prospect?
The U.S. is so focused on the expansion and the potential expansion of China in Asia that it's actually missing where China's primary interests lie currently. It's worrying so much against potential invasion of China in Taiwan, which I think is inevitable, but another program, another time. And it's actually missing what it could do. It probably can't stop an invasion of Taiwan. It can keep China's influence at bay by being proactive, responsible, and definitely promising partner for these nations in the Middle East. But China is filling the void that's left by the U.S.'s lack of attention, and that's been left by its focus on events in the East as opposed to the Middle East. So we see it's positioning itself as a strategic role player in the region following expanding relations with Persian Gulf countries. It signed a 25-year strategic cooperation agreement with Iran in 2021 and has followed that up with 6-year strategic deals with Gulf Cooperation Council. Simon, as we begin to close out the program, very real concerns in regard to the impact this could have on the Abraham Accords, but we continue to look to the Lord, who is sovereign, who's in control of it all, who has it all in his hands.
Absolutely. So I want to thank you for watching tonight's edition of Behind the Headlines, and there can be no mistaking the fact that we're seeing a huge geostrategic shift in the Middle East as China's become the most dominant player that not only endangers Israel but also endangers America's influence in the world and the region, and that's why we've got to continue to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. So thank you for watching this week's edition of Behind the Headlines.